Deleted Session, January 14, 1978. Good evening. We will begin with some rather general statements. Because of the nature of your society, a large number of people cultivate what I will call an outside-attuned consciousness. Naturally, sensation and knowledge must, of course, come through enjoyment and use of the physical body, and through the data received from the physical environment, with which the body must necessarily react. The outside-attuned consciousness, however, is almost dependent upon exterior stimuli for its sense of life and enjoyment. I do not want to oversimplify, yet such a type of consciousness is far more interested in exploring the nature of itself as it relates to exterior conditions or circumstances. It becomes relatively now opaque to subjective personal conditions, since it has no secure exterior framework against which the inner condition can be judged. Primarily, such a consciousness knows itself or tries to know itself only in relationship to others or exterior conditions. It avoids introspection. No consciousness is purely tuned into outside conditions only, of course. This type, however, is a cultivated specialization of consciousness in which its nature is known through the impact of exterior rather than interior conditions. Generally speaking, and only generally, it represents the consciousness familiar to many in your society, most likely the majority. I do not want to set up polarities. I do want to give you some background, however. For some of your attitudes from childhood in your society, you were as children told, in one way or another, that it was healthy to enjoy sports and outside activity, to join in games, to be outgoing with playmates, and all of that is of course quite true. Children are also taught, however, that reading for anything but short periods was somehow unhealthy. That daydreaming or staying alone for anything but a brief period meant that the child was withdrawn and that his activities or hers were somehow unnatural. Children were urged in one way or another to be aggressive, competitive, and generally to fit the conventional idea of the extrovert. It often seemed that there was no in-between point, and if you did not fit one mode, you must therefore take your stand and be the other. Many men and women in the same fashion, who do not fit the conventional sexual frameworks, take stands in the same way. A man may decide he wants to be a homosexual because he cannot fit into the usual pattern. There is obviously, however, no contradiction between hobbies of subjective thought and creativity and the physical enjoyment of the body and its abilities. If you believe, however, that you must have one at the expense of the other, then you will always face a dilemma between exterior and subjective activity. Your friends, the Galahans, inhibit their subjective natures strongly, both of them. Ralph noted, as I was speculating about the other day. He said, they are indeed afraid of aging, and so press onward in more and more exterior activity, because they fear that age will show itself there first. They forget the nature of youthful thoughts. They believe there is a polarity, and they have chosen the other side. When you were both children, to some degree, each of you felt that you were different, because of your intense subjective activity, and to some extent, the difference for both of you. You felt that you had to fight for the freedom to pursue subjective reality. Since you are obviously able to enjoy physical activity at times, you chose to remain alone rather than play with the others. As you matured, you each to some degree carried beliefs that physical activity and subjective activity were somehow, and to varying degrees, opposed to the other, one being accepted by society and the other frowned upon. I do not want to duplicate material. At one time, however, you bravely curtailed physical activity for what you considered the sake of your subjective freedom. You quickly dismissed the idea after a taste of it. Robert accepted that idea, believing he must make a choice. All of this, you see, must be considered in the light of our decision, for it involves varying degrees of self-disapproval and the polarities of thought, so that the contradictions occurred in your experience. Thought there were more, of course, in basic terms. You believed that you should be outgoing, vigorous, somewhat competitive, and you believed you should be socially oriented, while at the same time you believed that those things conflicted in a basic way with other drives. You felt you should be introverted, have periods of isolation, time to sit and think, to write and paint, to look inward rather than outward, in periods of intense inner activity that were enjoyable and productive. You disapproved of yourselves because you were not at the same time socially oriented, vigorously involved in exercises or physically oriented pursuits, and so you disapproved of yourselves. When you were both working outside with jobs, out in the community, going to bars and dancing, seeing neighbors often and having parties, you disapproved of yourselves because you were not sufficiently subjective, isolated, etc. You felt you could not merge the separate groups of attributes because they were diametrically opposed in your minds. Instead, of course, there are gradations of behavior and patterns or rhythms in your lives that would naturally flow one into the other, released from the artificial polarities. The polarities are artificial, but there is no doubt that in your society and times, the exterior-tuned consciousness is the most paramount. It, of course, by its nature, is not given to introspection, so it does not question its stance as deeply. So some of this disapproval has to do with your own attitudes about the attitudes of others as they view your lives. You find yourself lone owners somewhat. You see others shoving their work themselves. You disapprove of yourself for not doing so. You feel you could not do so, that you are not physically that vigorous. Ralph noted, as I told Jane today. She said, this is symbolic, of course, of your attitudes, for you feel that the lifestyles are completely different and polarized. Physically, for example, you are in much better physical condition than Joe Bumble, but he is a prime example to you of the exteriorized consciousness. And while on the one hand you envy his shoveling the work, you are to some extent, underneath all that, somewhat contemptuous. Somewhat now. I do not want to speak too strongly, but simply help you become aware of some feelings you might have submerged because you think they are not nice. This does not mean that you should begin shoveling walks tomorrow with your attitude. They are classic, distorted stories of the weakly scholar as opposed to the hearty sportsman. To some extent, the same applies to Ruber. You are surrounded by propaganda saying that the body will not perform in a healthy, vigorous manner if you indulge primarily in subjective activity. If you sit at your desk, for example, much of the propaganda is nearly invisible. It appears everywhere. The body and mind are one. Base books, or rather philosophy, suggesting that the eyes were not made for reading, is an example of a different kind, implying that there were no books when the eye was created, and so therefore it is not natural for the eye to see letters, while it is nature for the eye to see, say, trees. The body adjusts its rhythms in a quite healthy manner to your activities, and without polarized habits of thought, periods of deep creativity will automatically be followed by periods of walking, natural exercise of one kind or another, in which subjective thought and body motion are synchronized. That is background. Now give us a break, and we will continue. You choose to be leaders rather than followers, and you would not have it otherwise. By nature, leaders are not so much at odds with their word as they are ahead of it. The bungalows, for example, envy you, as do the gardeners, but they are afraid of subjective reality. They have taught their consciousness to conform. These ideas with the last station have to do with Ruber's partitioning of his spontaneity, for he also felt that you had to choose one way or the other, and that to protect your subjective freedom you had to inhibit the externally oriented spontaneity that was sanctioned by most of the society, because you could not do both. This is again, and to some extent, on both your parts, black and white thinking. Here, as opposed to the apartment, where the lifestyles were simply in a more transitory situation, you have both again dramatized yourself to some degree as outsiders in an active fashion, disapprovingly seeing yourself in relationship to your neighbors, but not constructively. You could instead have strayed your positive and constructive differences for you more to the neighborhood again to some extent. Excuse the constant qualifying. Your move has helped the neighbors see themselves in different lights. Conventionally, they enjoy having what they think of as highly creative people in the neighborhood. Your lives make them think of their own hidden aspirations. You bring up questions for them. In a strange way, they feel comforted by your presences. They know there are differences, but they are far more willing to see the creative aspects of your lives than you give them credit for. You have fallen for the same conventionalized beliefs that they have, only you chose the subjective side. They were so afraid of subjective thought that they ran willy-nilly in the other direction, and they envy your choice, again, to some degree. In summer, you think you should do the law. You feel that conflicts with your subjective interests, and that the two are not compatible. You see Joy frantically mow his lawn. You are contemptuous, somewhat, and envious at the same time. The same applies to the snow, so you disapprove of yourself whether you have the grass or the snow taken care of, or whether you try to do it yourself. Give us a moment. Ruber has had excellent results with Elmer, and you should rejoice. You do, yet you think, at what expense did Elmira come? What restrictions of physical activity, and had you been somewhat different? Would it all have been necessary? At the same time, you think that Ruber is at least spontaneous in his art, while it seems to you that you are not spontaneous enough in that area. While it seems to you that you are not spontaneous enough in that area, give us a moment. Some of your inner feelings are difficult for me to express, because they are in so many layers that I am not sure of their relative importance. To some extent, again, then, the sale of a book, a new sale, is somehow connected in your mind with disapproval of yourself, Joseph. In that Ruber seems able to express what I think you interpret as competitiveness, that you feel you are not expressing, and you add that to your arsenal of disapproval. All of this is connected with the chat difficulties. The food is not basically related, except as it reflects other issues. Those are relatively shallow, but do operate. That certain foods are good for the body and others are not. that heart disease is connected with cholesterol and dairy products, while skim milk is innocent. The chest difficulty reminds you of heart problem, and you react negatively then to whole milk. Now, I want to stress that you must not emphasize your feelings that you are at odds with the world. To some extent or another, each person feels at odds with the cultural environment, or worse, with their most intimate companions. You cannot expect to be involved in creative activity of an important sort, and at the same time see through the eyes of others. The 1973 session book Rupert is reading has helped him, simply because it rerouses the feelings of psychic, creative, and physical improvement he did achieve, and because it contains in capsule form most all of the important material I have given, though some of it no longer applies. At certain stages, your experience relatively coincides with events in the past, so that some material attains double strength. Generally, however, your hopes and faith in Rupert's recovery became somewhat eroded. Your feelings of helplessness were the result, as given in the last session, but nowhere did you thoroughly work out in the past the problems of self-disapproval. Or if one managed to attain a foothold, the other did not. So you could not properly reinforce each other creatively, and became quickly discouraged. This summer, you compared your way of life with those polarized ideas, with the way of life of the construction man, for example. The disapproval causes you to exaggerate the differences, rather than glorify them as you should, though glorify may be too strong a word. Rupert's physical condition becomes a materialization of those concepts, exaggerated so that he is not able to go forth in the world, believing the polarity so great, with him and the subjective activity having the disadvantage. You believed to some degree, varying degrees, but jointly, that subjective activity and creative activity must be achieved at the expense of some physical expression. You obviously did not fall for that to the extent Rupert did. And all of this must be considered also in the light of the religious and scientific views, with Rupert particularly, in which the spontaneous self was considered the psychological villain of the society and the individual. The spontaneous self is the guardian. That is what Rupert is learning. The Galahans treat spontaneity only when it is expressed through physical motion. To some extent, again, Rupert trusted it only when it was expressed through subjective motion. I suggested that you take walks, Joseph, some time ago, simply to rearouse your natural love of that activity. Give us a moment. You can see how Rupert's body responds when he suspends self-disapproval, and when he allies himself with his nature, and when you both suspend your sense of helplessness in that area. If you continue as you are, you can indeed expect quite startling improvements, but you are not to compare, either of you, Rupert's condition with the Galahans' skiing, any more than they could compare their attempts at subjective journeying with Rupert's inner soaring. Avoid absolutes. All Rupert wants is normal motion. You saw the response in his leg this evening. The important neck and jaw areas are definitely releasing, and the eyes will swiftly begin to resume their normal activity. If you continue as you are, your own physical vigor is there, and can express itself, comparatively speaking, with far greater ease once you rid yourself of those polarized concepts and the disapproval that goes with them. Robert stands taller, observably. He is using muscles in new ways, gaining strength and vitality. Your body is already in excellent shape. In general terms, we are not speaking of athletes. It would need, naturally, some period of training if you were thinking of climbing mountains or expected to ski down a good slope tomorrow, but it is well prepared for normal activity. Only your beliefs impede it, so work with those beliefs before you shovel the drive. It is the dilemma behind the whole thing that is important, the implied conflicts between subjective and objective activity, and the responsibilities you feel this entails. You have both moved through many periods of understanding where others might have stopped, and the going ahead always involves new challenges. Your friend Bill Callahan's operation represented a triumph on his part, for he regained his health in one important area, an achievement of worth. But it also represented a failure of a kind, a stopping point at a certain level of development. This does not mean that medical help is always detrimental at all, for the intents of the individual always apply. The tension between the two couples, and yet the latent sympathies are what unites you. That is, are what unites you and the Galahans. For Bill does have significant psychic abilities that he inhibits for fear they will operate against his survival in the world of business. Give us a moment. I do not want anything to impede this not new important work of progress. Now, walking would not be particularly constructive for you. The own exercises, or simply some quiet yoga breathing exercises, or however, and either would relieve the feelings in the chest considerably on the physical level. Robert's vitality, re-emerging, shows itself in his desire for physical intimacy, and will hopefully, as you continue this path, be reflected in all other areas of life. Do you have questions? Rob said, "No, I guess not. Probably, but I can't think of them." She said, "The 1973 book would be a help for you also, if you find the time to look it over. I bid you then a hearty good evening." Rob said, "Thank you," said good night.